Did we touch base too on the fact that we really feel that, FDA to remove the drug from the shortage list only takes into account what the manufacturer is telling them?
It was really, really cool being there. Listen to this.
Good afternoon or good day, folks. Thank you for joining us for this roundtable related to FDA's abrupt resolution last week of the Tirzepatide injection shortage. You're going to hear over the next few minutes from a geographically and I think professionally diverse group of pharmacists who are all saying the same thing, that FDA's resolution of the shortage is creating extraordinary uncertainty and challenges for them, and more importantly, for their patients. And that's what we're going to focus on, the patient impacts of this decision by FDA. Following their remarks, we'll have time for questions. I would ask you to use the raise hand function here on Zoom, or to write your question in the chat, and Ashley's going to sort of facilitate that after we hear comments from these pharmacists. As you've probably already noted, we are recording the roundtable, and we will send you the recording as quickly as we can get that produced and to you. So last week on Wednesday, I believe, FDA marked Tirzepatide injection as resolved on the FDA drug shortage list. Prior to that, and since December of 2022, Tirzepatide injection had been listed as currently in shortage. And I've had the opportunity over the past several months to talk to many of you. I suspect you are aware that FDA guidance allows a compounding pharmacy to prepare a copy of an FDA-approved drug when that drug appears as currently in shortage on the FDA drug shortage list. And indeed, that's what compounding pharmacies and outsourcing facilities have been doing over several months. As a result, many, I wish I could put a hard number to it, but many patients are benefiting from compounded therapies, not only compounded Tirzepatide, but also compounded Semaglutide. The issue that this resolution of the shortage has raised because of its abruptness is that a lot of patients have been left flat-footed by it. Patients taking compounded Tirzepatide injection are going to need to be transitioned to the FDA-approved drug, Mounjaro or Zepbound. And that, in many instances, is going to take some time. They've got to get in to see their prescriber. They need to have a discussion with the prescriber about whether the FDA-approved drug is indeed the right medication for them. They're probably going to want to check with their insurance to see if the drug might be covered by their insurance. And then there may be a waiting period with the insurance company where the insurance company is, it's called a prior authorization, and they have to wait through that period to see if the insurance company is going to cover the drug. And then they've got to take the prescription down to the pharmacy and hope, right now beyond hope, that the pharmacy can actually acquire the FDA-approved drug. And so the abruptness of the resolution has left a lot of these patients in limbo, and they are doing all the things, trying to do all the things that I've just mentioned, and they are being assisted by pharmacists across the country. You're going to hear from some of those pharmacists now. I want to make clear, questions, comments today are about the impacts of this on patients. I don't doubt some of you want to talk about what's the impact on the compounding business and that sort of thing. Those are questions and conversations for another time, and I would be happy to take your questions in that regard in a separate phone call. But we want to talk about the patients. I also want to reiterate what some of you already know. FDA guidance treats traditional compounding pharmacies, 503A pharmacies, differently in this matter than it does 503B outsourcing facilities. 503A and 503B are sections of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We're gonna presume for now that you know what an outsourcing facility is. We can explain that later in questions if we need to. The moment that FDA marked Tirzepatide injection as resolved on the shortage list, 503A pharmacies, traditional compounding pharmacies, had to cease immediately preparing that drug in what FDA determines as inordinate amounts. FDA guidance says inordinate amounts is any more than 4 a month. That may seem a little arbitrary, but that's what the guidance says. So they had to stop immediately. 503B outsourcing facilities have in guidance a 60-day window in which they can continue to distribute the drugs. We have real questions about how that pertains in this situation with such a blockbuster shortage drug. And we've asked FDA for answers to those questions and are awaiting that response. In the Q&A, you may want to ask what are those questions, and we can talk about those at that time. For now, I'm gonna start with a show of hands. For our 4 pharmacist panelists, who has been unable to fill patient prescriptions since Tirzepatide injection was removed from the shortage list last week? Can you raise hands? Yeah, all 4 of you. Okay. I'm going to start with Scott Welch. Scott is, and Scott, I'm really going to allow you to sort of introduce yourself. Scott is the pharmacist in charge, one of the owners of Prestons Pharmacy in Arlington, Virginia. Some of you on this call have been in that pharmacy for a tour and a conversation with Scott, so he is known to some of you. Scott, you were one of the first pharmacists to reach out to me to tell me that you were on your wholesaler portal and you were getting big goose eggs in terms of the availability of Zepbound and Mounjaro on the day after the shortage was resolved. Can you tell us about your experience, what you're hearing from patients in terms of being able to acquire that drug? If you'll guide us through what you've experienced over the past week, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for everyone. Oh, my lights just went out. Being on the call. Prestons Pharmacy, it's a hybrid pharmacy. So we do both traditional retail dispensing and compounding. And over the last 2 years, we provided the compounded GLPs along with the commercial products. And I knew as soon as I heard that the FDA had taken the compounded or Tirzepatide injection off the shortage, that there was going to be a hysteria from patients and providers. So the first thing I did was think about the patients and said, well, if I can't compound this anymore, I need to get in the commercial product. I need an answer. So day 1 after the shortage, I logged into Cardinal, who's our wholesaler, and I had a 0 allocation for both Zepbound and Mounjaro. So on day 1, where I was planning to bring in stock for my patients to offer a solution, I didn't have the ability to do that. I immediately took a screen capture of it and sent it over to Scott because I was at a loss of words. I didn't expect that. When something comes off a shortage coming from the FDA, I at least expect to be able to get product and service our patients. And over this last week, concerns have grown from providers, from patients. They've kind of left holding the bag. And what I say is my team has gone from pharmacists to therapists. All we can do is console these patients, try to work up a solution when we don't have a ton of options. To echo what Scott talked about at the beginning of this call, you have to have a conversation with your provider as a patient, right? About switching from a compound back to the commercial product. You got to see if your insurance is going to cover it, which I will tell you that we process a lot and a lot of them are not being covered. Or they might offer a prior authorization. That prior authorization can take up to 2 weeks to hear back. We're talking about patients going without this medication for a substantial amount of time when they've had access to this. I have one woman who has been on compounded Tirzepatide for about 1.5 years. She tried Semaglutide, it didn't work. The doctor put her on compounded Tirzepatide, and it was a life-changing medication. She's down 75 pounds. She's on a maintenance dose. She's very adherent to the medication, a rock star, ideal patient. And she called me last week, and I was on the phone with her for 45 minutes trying to come up with a solution, trying to console her, trying to tell her it's going to be all right. When in reality, I don't know if it is. I don't know if I can get product. I don't know if my competitor down the street has product. And since then, since day 1 of the shortage, I've been lucky to get maybe 1, maybe 2 box on a real good day of the commercial product. It still is not available for me to bring in. And it's kind of left us, consoling patients, providers, trying to come up with a solution. Some providers want to switch patients from tirzepatide to semaglutide, but again, that's not a one-to-one conversion. That has to be done with nuance and thinking about the patient and the dosing. And so that all involves a lot of time, a lot of work on the provider side. And it's tough as we work through it, as kind of the spigot was shut off, and the patients were really the ones that were impacted.
Thanks, Scott. Jennifer Birch, you are in Durham, North Carolina. You are the owner of Central Compounding Center. Can you tell us a bit about what you're seeing and hearing from patients?
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here today and being interested in this topic, because certainly compounding has not been at the forefront of conversation over my career as much as it has been in the last year. I own Central Compounding Center, and I own a retail store on the about 15 miles away on the north side of town. And so we are seeing the same thing that Scott's seeing as far as allocation at the retail store. Is I can order the commercial products, but I can get 1 box a day. So that I can take care of 30 patients a month. I compound for a lot more than 30 patients a month. And so what we've seen is patients freaking out and doctors freaking out. And my phone's blowing up while I'm just sitting in here with a doctor saying, "Oh my God, help me." And I had one text me last night that said, "You just got to keep making it." And I'm like, dude, no, that's not how this works. And so, we have a huge educational gap that has to be filled with providers on when we can compound and when we can't compound and that type of thing. And they've never really had to face this before. I serve patients in the state of North Carolina, both locally here in Durham, which we affectionately call the City of Medicine. And getting in to see your doctor can take 2 or 3 weeks if you're lucky. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 months to get in to see your provider. And when you start talking about switching drugs, as Dr. Welch was just talking about, doctors a lot of times want to see that patient face to face to have that conversation. And it may take several weeks, several months to get in to see them. And then, gosh forbid, you have to go through the prior authorization process. And that's like a maze in itself. We ship within the state of North Carolina. And so we ship into the western part of the state, which has been just affected by the hurricane. And so not only have some of those patients not even heard the news, when they get to order a refill, they're going to find out that, they can no longer get their medication. And so we're trying to communicate, but we can only communicate so much. We only have so much staff to be able to answer a text message or a email when we send those. So we've had to prioritize sending those messages out to make sure that we're able to do that. And I've been not usually my job to work on answering text messages, but I have answered hundreds in the last 2 days here. We have chosen to source some Tirzepatide from a 503B facility to bridge the gap for patients, because we know their 503Bs operate by a different set of guidelines than we do. And so we have chosen that route. So I leveraged all of the credit I have in the last couple of days on my credit cards to source some of those products so that we can continue to serve patients while they try to figure out what plan B will be for them. And so that's where we're going at the moment.
Jen, are you serious? You've used your personal credit cards to try to cover the cost of these drugs so that you can serve these patients?
Well, most of my credit cards are in my personal name, even though they're for the business. And so, yes, that's how that works. We've been working 10 hours a day with this. Outside of when we first got COVID vaccine in and the local media was at my retail store, I have never seen the amount of patients coming in or calling or texting. And so it has been a real stretch on our staff. And so that's where, if we would have had some notice from the FDA, we could have done that a little more methodically with a little more fine-tuned process than we're doing right now.
Good. Thank you, Jen. John Herr. John is the owner of Town and Country Compounding Pharmacy in New Jersey, just outside Manhattan. John, you are hearing from patients and prescribers as well, as we understand it?
Oh yeah, we're all doing that. like I mentioned, my pharmacy is compounding only, and we're one of the first fully accredited compounding pharmacies in New Jersey for non-sterile, sterile, and the new USP 800, which is hazardous drug compounding. So we actually supply a lot of different people, and because I think people were mentioning like the 503A is not regulated, we are highly regulated. And all of the things that we have to do to maintain our accreditations and do all the testing and everything on these drugs that we've been making, puts us right at the top upper echelon of compounding pharmacies. It's become so, regulated and difficult to maintain all of that accreditation. There's states, I know 2 states off the top of my head that don't have one compounding pharmacy that's performing sterile compounding anymore. Because of that, we actually get calls to do central fill arrangements. And a lot of these pharmacies are, traditional pharmacies or hybrid pharmacies that do some traditional and some compounding. And, we were supplying the Tirzepatide to them as well, because, a lot of the patients are coming to them because that's where they think they can get their branded, Mounjaro or Zepbound. And, when this went into effect, they were still calling me, expecting me to be able to still central fill it for them, which is a central fill. Again, it's approved by my state, and we do that. But when we told them no, and I started asking, like, don't you now have availability from your wholesalers for this? And I got, like Scott said, every one of them told me basically they would be lucky if they got 1 piece a day when they order. I tried to order because I am a pharmacy, so I do have contracts. So I tried to order some for my patients, and I didn't have any past history because I'm not a traditional retail pharmacy, so I couldn't get any. So that was a big problem. And then, I did have like one woman who actually, again, she came to me, she had a real success story, lost over 50 pounds on Tirzepatide. She was on Semaglutide, previously, but, she didn't get the same weight loss with that one. She lost 50 pounds. Most people would think, well, that's great, but that's, she has more to go. And it's really been life-changing for her. So, she obviously thought she could get some from me, which I told her we couldn't. That's the person I tried to order it for that I couldn't. She tried other pharmacies retail pharmacies where she couldn't get the drug. So she actually called Lilly because, she was very adamant about staying on Tirzepatide. And she, was willing to, its cost wasn't an option for her. She wanted to order from Lilly the vials because she heard that there's vials available. But, she's on the upper dose now, and the vials only are, I think they're 2.5 and 5 milligram. So there wasn't enough in a vial to get her dose. But when she spoke to Lilly, she was saying, well, that's okay. I'll just buy, if I'm 15 milligrams, I'll get 3 vials, and do it that way. And then Lilly refused to sell her 3 vials. So that was a little disheartening, them saying that they have it available, but now they won't, allow the patient who needs it to get it. And then my other fear, because I do a lot of clinical trials I do clinical trials for pharma, Department of Defense, universities. So I'm very familiar with the different types of drugs that are out there. And we're seeing, patients speaking to us, and I'm also seeing in social media, there's something that's called like a research grade chemical. And I think a lot of people think because it's research grade, it must be a better grade, but it's not. Research grade is for like a university to use and not for human use. But there's this black market that's been created, and patients are going and buying these research grade peptides, and they're not even like, when they get it from us, it's sterilized in a liquid form for injection. These research grades are typically what we call lyophilized or a dry powder. So, number one, they were never intended for human use. Number two, they don't have preservatives. And there's this whole black market that you can go and look on the different social media platforms of people teaching one another how to find sterile water, how to reconstitute it. They're pulling the cap off that they should have never been doing. So this, in my opinion, is really putting patients at risk. They're so desperate that they're ordering things from China that is unregulated and ordering these research grade chemicals, which is very concerning to me as a pharmacist.
Yeah, and much of what John's talked about the sort of the research grade black market, people getting their advice online existed before FDA resolved this shortage last week, but it seems to have grown just based anecdotally in what I'm hearing from John and from others, as patients don't seem to have anywhere where else to turn. Let's move west, Shelby Witt is a pharmacist with Montana Apothecary and Company. And Shelby, I know you guys serve an awful lot of rural patients. I also know that you're a little bit of a different animal from what we've heard from these other pharmacies. Why don't you tell us about it?
Thanks, Scott. Yep, I'm Shelby. I'm owner and pharmacist of Montana Apothecary. From the rural aspect, for patients in rural Montana and other areas that have limited access to healthcare, the impact of losing Tirzepatide is especially profound. We have rural patients that don't have the option to go to another pharmacy to find their medications. They don't have a secondary go-to. There is no other solution. So these individuals have already faced significant challenges. They live hours away from the nearest pharmacy. We're shipping to them. It already takes 4 days to get their medication. Tirzepatide was a game changer for a lot of my patients. It really helped stabilize their cardiac health, manage their diabetes, their blood sugar control, and that lifeline's been abruptly taken away from them right now. I have a gentleman living in the northeastern corner of the state in Montana, and he lives hours from the nearest city. His life was changed really dramatically because of Tirzepatide. So for years, he really struggled with cardiac issues, high blood pressure, cholesterol. It wouldn't come down. We got him going with Tirzepatide. Everything began to shift. His blood pressure stabilized. The LDL cholesterol came down. Triglycerides came down. He was a new person. He really was. Despite the distance of living in such a remote area, he managed it, and it was worth getting the Tirzepatide in his hands. It became something that he could count on for his health and for his heart health. Now that it's been cut, and without access to that, it's brought him wondering what he's going to do, and the fear of unstable cholesterol, worsening diabetes. It really just reminded me it's not a matter of convenience for some of these patients. It's a matter of life and death and his health. That patient's sense of stability with Tirzepatide and that medication has been pulled out from under him. There's not a stable go-to for him anymore. And then to flip that in terms of the providers that we have, and we're very spaced out in Montana. We did an emergency Zoom call with 38 Montana providers the other day and to discuss what was going on. It was a difficult conversation to have with them. We had to tell them that despite our best efforts, we can no longer facilitate the drug orders. And that was a sense of frustration and concern that was palpable. You could feel it. These providers care deeply about their patients, and most of them are neighbors to their patients. They know where they grew up, and they're trying to find solutions on a patient-by-patient scenario. So placing providers now in a position also that they must contend with these unforeseen difficulties is been difficult on the rural aspect as well.
Good, thank you. This might be a good time to turn to some questions. There are some already queued up that I think Ashley's going to walk us through in chat, and then we will certainly take questions from the floor, so to speak. If you do have a question and you don't want to put it in chat, just do the raise hand button on here, and you can ask questions of our four pharmacists, or Tennille Davis, who is APC's Advocacy Chief and Compliance Officer, longtime compounding pharmacist, is on the call, and then I can, and feel sure I will, take questions as well. So Ashley, you want to start?
Yeah, and also you please feel free to message me directly as well if that makes you more comfortable. So would love to start with Arthur's question here, which, you know, sounds like the first step in like what preparation did compounders give patients for this inevitable step by FDA? Was there information given to them in advance, I assume to the patients, to have a warning that they would face an immediate cutoff of the compounded drug when it came off of shortage?
Yeah, let's talk about our interactions with FDA. A few months ago, 3 or so months ago, I informally reached out to FDA to raise this issue. We had concerns about transition of care when the FDA-approved drugs came out of shortage. We were hearing a lot of ballyhooing from Eli Lilly in particular about the fact that their drug was once again available. And so we had hoped to indicate to FDA that they really needed to manage this transition. Following that, well, and let me say one thing about FDA. I hope none of my comments today are meant to disparage FDA. These are hardworking folks. They are people of integrity. I am convinced that the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand's doing over there. And so our interactions are generally with the Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance, but there's also the Shortage Drug Division. And we've been communicating with both, and sometimes they agree with each other and sometimes they don't. We had urged in our messages to both of them that they either telegraph in advance that a resolution of shortage was coming so that we had some period to prepare patients, or to grant what is, and I don't want to get too technical with you guys, it's called enforcement discretion, but for FDA to basically say, we're going to grant a 60-day period after the drug comes out of shortage in which the pharmacy can continue to dispense the compounded version while the pharmacy demonstrates that it is working with the prescriber and the patient to transition the patient to the FDA-approved drug. Unfortunately, none of those things has happened. We wrote to FDA again last week, a day after the shortage was resolved, to ask again for that off-ramp, that 60-day period. We wrote again on Monday in partnership with the National Community Pharmacists Association to reiterate that request and to also raise some questions about compliance with FDA guidance, particularly as it relates to 503Bs and that 60-day tail that they have to continue to distribute drugs. I do think what is happening here, and this is me, this is, if you'll forgive an opinion on my part. I mean, traditionally, FDA looks at drug maker data as the statute allows. It makes a decision that supply is not sufficient to meet demand for a drug, and it places a drug in shortage. And it continues to monitor that data ongoing. And at some point, a day comes when FDA once again judges that supply is sufficient to meet the demand, and the drug comes off the shortage list. It affects some patients, but it's generally not a good deal, not a big deal. I believe FDA has failed to recognize that this shortage is not like other shortages. In terms of the number of patients affected, the number of patients who have been prescribed compounded therapies during this shortage, it is not on the same scale as shortages we've seen before. And in failing to recognize that, they unfortunately have created this anxiety and uncertainty that you've heard these patients talk about, that these pharmacists talk about that their patients are experiencing.
Could I add to that?
Yeah, sure, John.
Okay, so you know, I've been around for a long time, and you know, and I think I took the meaning of that question like, did we prepare our patients that this was inevitable? But you know, I've been around with a lot of drug shortages, like two that of recent. It would be like lidocaine epinephrine, which again is an ubiquitous drug that, you know, doctors need for surgery, or Omnipeg, you know, was another shortage that was unavailable, and we stepped in and helped with those at the time. But in the past, when FDA really took the drug off shortage, it's like the floodgates were just open. I mean, there was just no reason for anybody to turn to us because there was just so much supply back into the marketplace. But unfortunately, with this drug, that's not what we're seeing. So, I mean, I think our hope as compounding pharmacists was always that when it really went off a shortage, there just really wouldn't be a need for us to make it anymore. But in this case, that, in my opinion, is not what has occurred.
So did it never occur to any of you that something like this might happen? And given the difficulties, especially that people have with paying for the brand name drugs and getting prior authorization, did it never occur to you that there would be some difficulty transitioning?
Hey, Art, glad to see you're on the call. I'll take this. Yeah, so you know, compounding the GLPs, there was a tremendous amount of education from start to finish, because when it was novel, everyone was asking, how can you do this? So there was a tremendous amount of education, not only to the patient, but the provider, of why and how we're able to do this. And part of that education up front was, you know, this can come to an end if and when this comes off shortage. However, no one has a crystal ball. No one knows when the FDA is going to do this. And to echo Scott's sentiment, it's unprecedented to have a blockbuster branded drug on shortage for 2 years. So the more we reminded patients, the more it's kind of like, maybe not. We've been riding this thing for so long. Maybe Scott, me as a pharmacist, doesn't know what he's talking about. But this is commonplace, not only when you're talking about coverage and prior authorizations, like that's commonplace in any medication, right? So yeah, we can warn them to it, but until a patient has gone through that process and really understands the trials and tribulations of trying to get something approved, it's one thing hearing it and another thing living it.
And Scott, am I correct that the prior authorization has a shelf life? In other words, it's not for perpetuity. And so if you ask for a prior authorization, it might be good for the next month, but 6 months from now, maybe not.
Correct. And then you have to repeat the process for the same thing. Maybe the formulary changed on the insurance. Maybe they say now you've had to try and failed XYZ drug therapy before we even consider it. So it's what I would like to call it is a moving goalpost. As soon as you know where you're aiming and what your target is, the insurance or PBMs are moving that for the next go around, next round.
And if I can add to that, what we're seeing in North Carolina is the state employees health plan in North Carolina no longer covers any GLP injectable for weight loss. Period. Prior authorization or not.
Right.
So this actually leads into Caitlin's next question, which I think is great. Is about, so you answered it a little bit, but she says, I'm confused about why a patient would need to see their doctor again to get a prescription for, she says, Tirzepatide, in parentheses, Zepbound. So I'll let someone answer that part of it, that is not compounded. Are the prescriptions only applicable to compounded versions? Or would another appointment only be required if the patient was switching to Semaglutide? Tennille, can I start with you on that to kind of explain?
Sure. So it's a prescriber that determines a patient is appropriate to receive a compounded drug. Pharmacists do not make that determination. So a prescription would have had to have been written to one of these pharmacists for compounded Tirzepatide injection. Pharmacists aren't allowed to just decide, it's off of shortage, I'm just going to switch him back over to Zepbound. They actually are going to have to reach out to these patients' providers and get authorization to switch those prescriptions to a compound or from a compound, depending on where we're sitting in this shortage situation. Some providers might, authorize that switch with just, a fax authorization. And some providers might want to see their patient, especially if they're switching from a traditional vial and syringe system of administration of drugs to these pen devices, which are entirely different for patients. Older patients may have difficulty understanding, this switch of medication administration and need some counseling from the provider. And that's for the provider to determine, not the pharmacist.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, just for clarity, you have to have separate scripts for a branded drug versus a compounded drug. And so if the prescriber wants the patient on Zepbound, the prescription has to say Zepbound. If the prescriber wants the patient on compounded Tirzepatide, that's what the script should say.
And that was also why I made the distinction there with the in parentheses. Yeah. Jennifer, did you want to add something?
Some patients are difficult. I mean, everybody's so individualized, and you've got some patients that have been using some doses that are in between the commercial doses. And so, 5 milligrams was too little and 7.5 was too much. So they're using 6.25 milligrams or something to that effect. Those all will have to be worked through on an individual basis. And those are the kind of things that are going to require a patient appointment. It may require a patient appointment because the doctor may have to figure out if they even have access to that drug. The insurance company may require an appointment with the provider within a certain number of days to even cover it with prior authorization. So you have a lot of different hoops to jump through for patients. And so certainly if they're switching from Tirzepatide back to Semaglutide or vice versa, that gets complicated and the doctors don't know what to do with that either. So they usually lean on us to help to guide them with that. But then they usually like to see a patient for that. And I've got some doctors that were seeing patients every 2 months already to judge whether they needed to go to the next dose or that type of thing. And so this is a very hands-on process with patients.
So let's take a bit of a switch here and let's go back to some FDA questions from Joseph here. So the FDA has cited a 60-day transition policy within its own 2018 503B guidance for when shortages end, allowing orders received when the shortage was active to still be filled for the compounded drugs to be distributed for 60 days after the shortage ends. Has this been communicated to compounders, and has this policy been clarified? Scott, this is what you guys sent out immediately.
So let's quickly talk about the difference between 503Bs and 503As. 503A, Section 503A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, traditional pharmacy. There is a set of rules. There's a separate guidance document for 503As as it relates to compounding copies of FDA-approved drugs. The one Joseph cites is for 503Bs. 503Bs were created in the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013. There are only about 80 of them in the country. They are registered directly with, or licensed directly with FDA. And because they are required under federal law to adhere to current good manufacturing practices, they can distribute drugs without a prescription in larger quantities. Generally speaking, they were created to be able to distribute drugs to hospitals and clinics for in-clinic administration. But one of the things that the enabling legislation and subsequent FDA guidance allowed was for a 503B to distribute compounded drugs it had prepared directly to a 503A. And so we've had compounding pharmacies over the past year who are sourcing, and again, I don't want to, Jen, you mentioned that you guys, Jen's a 503A, traditional compounding pharmacy. She is sourcing GLP-1 drugs from a 503B and then dispensing them pursuant to a prescription. So FDA guidance, as Joseph has said, allows for a 60-day tail for 503Bs. Part of that is an incentive for 503Bs to actually step into the market when a drug is in shortage. Compliance with CGMP, the current good manufacturing practices, is expensive and time consuming. And so a 503B, drug goes into shortage today. Depending on the drug, it could be 3 to 9 months before a 503B can be up and running in producing that drug. And so they might look at it and say, well, I'm going to put all this upfront cost and time into it, and the day I begin to produce the drug comes out of shortage. I'm not taking that risk. And so what FDA allows is that 60-day tail so that 503Bs have a little more of an economic incentive to prepare the drug in the first place. They can continue to distribute after the drug comes out of shortage. But again, 503As don't have that tail. It's only Bs. And the difficulty right now is that 60-day window. If Jen is sourcing her GLP-1s from a 503B as a 503A that is now dispensing those drugs, does she still have the coverage that 60-day tail that the B had provides, because the B prepared the drug, but she's dispensing them? And that is abundantly unclear in FDA guidance. And so that's one of the questions, among some others, that we asked FDA this week and are awaiting their clarification. Joseph, that may be too long-winded for you. I hope it answers your question.
Hi. If I can just do a quick audio follow-up, would you be able to just, to your knowledge, speak on 503A versus 503B, like by proportion? Where are patients sourcing compounded tirzepatide? Is it 503 or mostly 503B?
Well, I will tell you, there are many more 503A pharmacies preparing GLP-1s than there are 503Bs. But that's not exactly what you're asking me. You're wanting data on, proportionality of who's doing what, and we do not have that data because for the most part, these drugs are not covered by insurance. There's no central repository to have much data at all on how much is being dispensed. We do know, if you go to the FDA website, and it's been about 3 weeks since I've looked at it. Tennille may have seen it more recently, but there were only 5 manufacturers, 5 503Bs listed there that said they were preparing GLP-1 drugs. But that list is only updated every 6 months, and that number could have grown. I will say, of the 5 listed there, 2 of them were duplicates of others. And so, in fact, it was really only 3 companies that were listed. So we are awaiting FDA updating their website so we can see. I presume there have been other 503Bs that have stepped into the space. My guess, there's certainly not 30 or 40 of them, but we are likely to have seen some growth the next time they report.
Arthur, did that also answer your question that you had as well? Awesome. All right. Thank you everyone for your patience. We want to make sure that we're getting to all of your questions, and I'm doing my best here. Let's go into Allison's question. So this is another FDA specific question. So are there aspects of the FDA criteria for resolving shortages that you believe should be more flexible to better accommodate patient needs? And based on your own observations, what changes would you recommend to the FDA to enhance its process for resolving shortages, particular for high demand drugs like medications like those for diabetes and weight loss drugs?
Yeah, and I think I've addressed that, so I won't say much more. I do think FDA should recognize that all shortages are not created equal, and in this instance, we hope FDA will take enforcement discretion. FDA takes enforcement discretion on a whole range of policy, so that's not out of the ordinary. It's just not unusual that they would do that, and so all we're asking is for FDA to construct a framework for certain drugs that as they come out of shortage, there is that off-ramp for transitioning patients. They absolutely have the authority to do that. So it's not like they have to go to Congress or they have to do notice and comment rulemaking to accomplish that.
And that is something we can share the letter that APC sent to the FDA asking for that 60-day off-ramp for 503As as well. Correct, Scott? Please correct me here if I say so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. And oh, Shelby, wow, does that lead into your next question? The APC is pushing for an off-ramp period for 503As. Exactly what I just mentioned. So the Outsourcing Facilities Association just sued the FDA to vacate the decision to remove Lilly's drugs from the shortages list. What kind of precedent is there for the FDA reversing the shortage decision or providing a longer transition period? And have there been other cases where the FDA did those things? Scott, Tennille, are y'all familiar with anything where they've done this before?
Well, drugs come on and off of the shortage list all the time. And I'm sure these pharmacists can tell you stories of when, a drug's been on the shortage list for 6 months and then it comes off for 3 months and it goes right back on. I suspect, frankly, we may begin to see that with the commercial Tirzepatide product just shortly. So it's not unusual to have drugs on and off. Pharmacist on the call, you got a better response to that question?
I'm happy to answer. Historically, drugs that go on the shortage list are mostly inexpensive generic medications because there's not as much of a financial incentive for drug manufacturers to make them. This has been unprecedented in my pharmacy career that a brand name blockbuster drug has gone on shortage almost immediately after its launch. I'm not aware of any precedent where FDA was sued when they removed something off the shortage list. This is all uncharted territory.
Did we touch base too on the fact that we really feel that FDA to remove the drug from the shortage list only takes into account what the manufacturer is telling them? Where when we were all up on the Hill last month talking to our representatives, we were trying to push for the fact that American, ASHP, the American Society of Hospital Pharmacists, they're a lot of times the forefront of seeing shortages, or the wholesalers that we all buy from. So why isn't FDA, instead of just taking the word from the manufacturer, looking at what the hospitals are putting on their list, or looking at the data that we all are receiving from our wholesalers? So that was one of our asks when we were on the Hill, is to try to get FDA to kind of look at a broader picture of really what's happening in the country when it regards to these types of drug shortages.
Yeah, we are interested in expanding FDA's ability to draw from a broader range of sources. The current statute only allows them to consider data from drug makers. And we believe they ought to be able to pull from hospital, from health systems, from pharmacies. Certainly, these folks are on the front lines. If there is a shortage coming, they're going to be among the first to see it. And yet FDA is somewhat bound by the law now that only allows them to draw from manufacturers. And so there is a legislative, I'll call it a proposal. It has not been introduced in the form of legislation, but I believe it will be shortly. That would allow that broadening. It would authorize FDA to draw from a broader pool. And interestingly, it would also extend that long tail that 503Bs have to 180 days. And both of those are not they are not connected to GLP-1 compounding at all. They are connected to making sure that FDA can anticipate shortages of a range of drugs and begin to deploy 503Bs, 503As, drug makers, others to meet the shortage need well before the shortage occurs. And that's something that's really hard for them to do right now.
Elaine, I just want to give you a quick, is there anything, I know you'd had your hand raised and you were coming up here, you'd messaged me and said you think you're good, want to make sure you're still good because I don't want to lose your spot in line.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to, well, my question was related to Arthur's initial question, which is, I mean, the compounding pharmacies, one could argue, have a responsibility to, I guess, not mislead patients into thinking that compounding is a permanent solution to getting the drugs. And so I was just wondering if you can give me specific examples of what you have done, if you have, to inform patients of how temporary this compounding is and the fact that this was never going to be a permanent solution. Because I understand what you're saying about how FDA did this and what you view as an abrupt move, but the drug was listed as available for several weeks before it officially came off the shortage list. So this kind of move was somewhat anticipated. So what, if anything, have you done to actually inform patients of how temporary the compounding products are?
So being listed as available and being available are two different things, right? So when that, there was a tremendous media push from Lilly to get that message out there, and we were flooded again with messages if it was available. And when we went to our wholesalers, it wasn't. And if you check the FDA website, it still listed it as shortage. So we're never trying to do put a mask up that compounding is here forever, but it's extremely difficult to battle an uphill battle when it seems like the media, whether whoever's influencing it, it's not the whole picture. You can say something's available unless I can get it in my pharmacy to actually dispense from a patient, it doesn't matter. And so patients call in, oh, I've heard it's available. Yeah, well, you heard that, but I can't get it. And then they'd call the CVS down the road, they didn't have it. They'd call Jim Bob down the road, they didn't have it. They'd call in other states, we're in the DMV, so you can go DC, Maryland, Virginia real quick, and no one has it. And then they call me back and they're like, oh yeah, no one has it. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you because I can only see what I can see. And if I hear something different, I'll let you know. But I mean, patients were always in the communication. We set up automatic texting for patients who wanted to put on file their commercial script. And I got a log of 600 scripts that I get one a day, and that's the top one that gets pinged off. A message goes out to the rest just to let you know I did not get any more in. And that's just a reoccurring cycle. And that's about all you can do. We can only do with what play with the hand that we're dealt.
All of our text communications said that we can compound it as long as it's on the FDA shortage list, and that was a repetitive message, and that was part of our templated message. And so patients knew that when it came off the shortage list, we could no longer do it. But the patients that were due for a refill the day after it came off a shortage list got stuck in limbo, right? They're not able to find medication. And so that's the people that, and I've got patients taking it for diabetes whose insurance wouldn't cover it for whatever purpose. And during the shortage, they were able to access it via the compounded route. And I had a lady in here in tears yesterday saying, this is the only thing that's worked to control my blood sugar, and I don't know what I'm going to do.
Sorry, quick follow-up question. What about the, if patients are able to access it not through a traditional retail pharmacy, but through the new vials, through Lilly Direct, do you not think that that is a viable kind of option for patients to go to right now?
Certainly that's an option, but I've
I-
heard those are unavailable as well, that they will not ship them to everybody, that there's an availability issue with that as well. And so just because they say it's available, it still has to be dispensed. And then my question is, when the manufacturer is talking about, and the FDA has gotten all these reports of errors because people are dosing things out of a vial with a syringe, and then they're going to mail a vial to a patient's house, who's going to teach them how to use it? They're going to come down and see me to how to use it? I can't teach them how to use that because I'm not their pharmacist. So who teaches that person how to use it?
John, didn't you have an example of one of your patients who tried to buy it directly from Lilly, like Elaine is asking about, and was told, no, you can't?
Yeah,
I
he
mentioned that earlier because,
Yeah.
she needed a higher dose than was available in the vial, and she was willing to purchase multiple vials from Lilly, but, they declined to authorize that for her.
Elaine, does that answer
Yes,
your question?
thank you.
Mhm. And just to let everyone know on the call, we can send out, we have a ton of screenshots of pharmacists who are members who are trying to get these drugs for their patients. And they have screenshots of it saying not available, not available. So hearing from the drug company that it's available and it actually being available does not seem to match up in all instances. So just to make that clear. I also want to say there was a question also about when compounding pharmacies aren't needed anymore. And I just want to very briefly clarify that compounding pharmacies are always needed because there are always patients who need a one-to-one prescription that have an allergy. Yes, branded drugs are always the first line of defense. However, there are a lot of patients, if you have a child, if you have a pet, if you are on hormone replacement therapy, that need compounding pharmacies. So it's not, this just happens to be one thing that compounding pharmacists are doing. And it's obviously what's gotten the news, but compounding pharmacy isn't going anywhere. This is a vital part of the healthcare system. I'd like to turn back to another question that we had from Caitlin, and this goes to the manufacturing process or the production process for pharmacists. There's been scrutiny from Eli Lilly about compounded tirzepatide, with the company saying it does not sell tirzepatide for compounding. Can you share how compounding versions are made and what is in the compounding version? We also, by the way, hear this all the time from Novo about semaglutide. This is the same issue. Tennille, I know that this is something that you are the queen of sourcing.
Yes. We're happy to share. We have some best practices we've made available to our members. One of them is called Best Practices for Shortage Drug Compounding, and it goes into a little bit more of the specifics that might be interesting to you. But Novo and Lilly have made these statements that they don't sell the API to compounding pharmacies, but of course they don't, because that's not how this whole thing works. Compounding pharmacies source active pharmaceutical ingredients from FDA registered manufacturers. Drug companies like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk also use these manufacturers called contract manufacturers to manufacture their API. And there's been media reports that these two pharmaceutical companies have used the same sorts of contract manufacturers that compounding pharmacies source their materials from. So the statements in the media are meant to be a little bit misleading because, of course, they would never sell API to compounding pharmacies. That's not how the drug supply chain works in our country. These compounding pharmacies have lots of tests that they have to perform on these sterile products before they're dispensed to patients, not include, sterility testing and endotoxin testing, but also potency testing and testing of the container to make sure that the closure can keep the product free from contamination throughout the life of the beyond use state, and particulate tests. There's a whole litany of tests that compounding pharmacies have to perform on these sterile products. So kind of some of the things in the media, like you don't know what's in there, are just not true, unless you're talking about illegal online, online things that our patients are purchasing without seeing a physician, that are not being dispensed by a legitimate state licensed compounding pharmacy.
And when we're saying statements in the media, by the way, we're not saying it's something that you have written. We are saying the statements that the drug companies are giving. They're just highly misleading.
There was a, can I comment, Ashley? There's
absolutely.
You got a, in here, Caitlin, you said, i.e. what is in these compounded versions? It's pretty interesting when you look at FDA approved products, when you open the package insert and it tells you the ingredients that are in a medication. For injectables, it tells you how much of the ingredient is in the medication. And so it tells you how much sodium chloride is in there, for example, or whatnot. And so we did our best to make our GLPs be identical to the formulation that's on the market. We didn't add extra ingredients. We didn't put B12. We didn't put any of those other things in there. It is pure Tirzepatide with sodium chloride and some buffers to make sure the pH is right and that kind of thing. It is what it is. And so to say that it's difficult to compound, it is not difficult to compound. The formulation is in the package insert. It's like having the recipe right there in front of you.
I know that we are getting close to our scheduled time. We had already anticipated that there would be quite a few questions. And so I believe everyone is able to stay on. And again, this is being recorded if you have to drop. So Madison, I'd like to come to your question here. And this is, some compounders are saying that they're still making customized versions of Tirzepatide. For example, and Jennifer, this goes to your point, adding components like glycine. What's your stance on this? And is it good or bad for patients?
Let's first of all note that what FDA did last week only applies to copies of the FDA approved drug. So quick tutorial. Sorry, I'm going to put on my professor's bow tie here. Compounding is called for in a couple of circumstances. FDA approved drugs are first line therapies. If an FDA approved drug is available and appropriate for a patient, it is always what should be dispensed. Compounding is called for, number one, when the FDA approved drug is not available, it's listed as currently in shortage on the FDA drug shortage list, a prescriber can write for a compounded drug. That is largely the situation we've been in with GLP-1 drugs over the past 24 months or so. The other circumstance in which compounding is appropriate is when a prescriber judges that there's no appropriate FDA-approved drug for a particular patient, and in their judgment, prescribes a compounded drug that is custom-made for that patient. And it might be a combination drug. And I'll talk about that in the context of GLP-1s in a minute. It might be a different dosage form. Your grandmother can't swallow this big old pill, and so they turn it into a suspension for her. It might be a different dosage strength. Your prescriber wants your patient to take bioidentical hormones, but the dosage needed is 75 milligrams of progesterone. There is no commercially available 75 milligram progesterone product. And so she would prescribe for the patient a compounded version. All of that is absolutely what compounding is for, understanding that FDA-approved drugs are always the standard. As it relates to Tirzepatide and Semaglutide, a number of prescribers have been writing for combinations of the GLP-1 with some other drug, and I'll let the pharmacist talk about some of that, or they have been writing, particularly with Semaglutide, for a sublingual version. There's no commercially available sublingual version of Semaglutide. There's a tablet version, Rybelsus, and there are the injectables, Wegovy and Ozempic. There's no sublingual. And so prescribers are judging that for certain patients, that is the right dosage form, dosage strength, dosage combination. John and Shelby, Jen, and Scott, do y'all want to comment on some of these combinations and maybe speculate as to why the prescriber believes they're right for the patient?
And I want to point out, this is the prescriber who is making this decision. It is not our pharmacists who are making the decision on what goes in.
The pharmacists don't get to decide. They may be consulted, but they don't decide.
I talked to a prescriber, yesterday, and she was telling me that, in her opinion, some of these combinations would be appropriate, especially on long-term use, because they worry about when you're losing all of that weight, that you're losing muscle mass. So some of the amino acids that people might want to add in there, would kind of help with that, to rebuild muscle, because we know amino acids are, proteins that, just like eating a steak, is going to help build that muscle. But I mean, that's just a small little sliver of what's going on here. Like in my pharmacy, we would just compound when we could compound it, we just compounded, like Jennifer said, we just took their recipe, reduplicated it, did all the testing and everything. And that's what we compounded because there was a shortage. So I'm sure there are those things that are going on there where they may want to do that, or there's a lot of use or a lot of physicians looking into what they're calling microdosing for different conditions. I looked, one physician was asking me about microdosing, having much smaller doses of the GLP-1s to like for children on the autistic spectrum disorder, just to shut off this food noise that they suffer from. So there are those things, but that's never going to solve the shortage because, in my opinion, it's such a small portion of what really is being done out there.
Yeah. Jen, you were about to say something? No, you aren't. Okay.
So Madison actually followed up and said that she's heard about this from 503B pharmacies. Madison, do you want to come off of mute?
I would just say, to my knowledge, the outsourcing facilities have to report what they make to the FDA. There's an outsourcing facilities product report. It only has data for the first 6 months of 2024, and only three outsourcing facilities are making tirzepatide, and they're making it by itself. Outsourcing facilities are a little bit more limited in what they can and cannot compound with. So tirzepatide, they would be able to compound with while it's on shortage, but once it's removed from the shortage list, outsourcing facilities can no longer compound with that API, even in, say, combination or novel products, because tirzepatide does not exist on a special list of API that is allowed to be used by outsourcing facilities. So 503A pharmacies may still have that capability now that tirzepatide is off of shortage, of creating these custom combinations or strengths or preservative-free versions based on a prescriber's order. But outsourcing facilities, after the 60-day window, absent of what's happening with their lawsuit, are no longer going to be allowed to use tirzepatide in any formulations.
Madison, does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Turning to Lauren Gardner's question, again, thanks you guys for hanging in there. We really appreciate it. So she's saying that y'all have said you can't or have trouble ordering or having trouble ordering adequate stock of the Lilly drugs. But can you give us a sense of how much you're hearing from patients about trouble finding the branded products versus being concerned about the price of them?
Yeah, I can jump in on this.
Yeah.
So like I said, we're in the DMV in a pretty affluent area, so pricing really isn't ever part of the conversation. It's availability, and for my patients specifically, it's finding the commercial product, not only for my own supply but my competitors in the local area. And my community, it's about 300 home community. Everyone knows I'm the pharmacist. I'm the local guy. I have been inundated with every type of social media request, whether it's a DM on Facebook, Instagram. They found my email on the website of, Aunt Tilly down the road asking, they finally got their PA through, but they went to the CVS in town and they don't have it. Do I know anyone? And unfortunately, I don't have any answers for them. So it's a continuing theme of availability and just finding the product, at least from my experience.
I can also say that, my staff is inundated with calls from the patients who, I think Jennifer had said the other day, used the word freaking out, and they're freaking out because they don't know where to get the drug. But we're also receiving lots of calls from the providers themselves, because I think, a lot of the patients are immediately calling their prescriber, and the prescribers are really not sure what's going on. So then the prescriber is calling us. So my staff is, fielding questions from both the patients as well as the prescribers as to where they can source these drugs.
Well, and I want to chase the end of Lauren's question, which is concerned about the price. Have you got, clearly the price of a compounded drug is incidental to the drug. It's not a reason for dispensing it. Generally speaking, compounded GLP-1s cost considerably less than the FDA approved drugs. Have you pharmacists had any of your patients experiencing sticker shock as they move from compounded version to FDA approved?
Unfortunately, I couldn't get the FDA-approved product to give them the sticker shock.
Well, I guess that's a good point. If you can't get the FDA-approved drug, there's no, yeah. Okay.
My dad always said you could sell it for, the price could be zero if you don't have any to sell. You can sell it for $0, but I don't have any to give you. So, we're still at that early early point of working with patients, and so we haven't presented them with sticker shock yet.
Can I jump in here, Ashley?
Please.
In terms of rural access too, like we don't, in opposition to Scott Welch, Montana doesn't have the option to go down the street to another pharmacy. So that has been, you can't call CVS, call Walgreens. You can call the local pharmacy. There's one local pharmacy per like 300 miles. So that's very limited. The second part of that is just the volume of calls that we've been getting in. We've transitioned our phone system to IVR because we can't handle the phone calls. And there's a phone tree set up and it says, if you are a provider asking about an injectable medication, press 1. If you are a patient asking about an injectable medication, press 2. So that's kind of the extreme that we have had to go to.
And just to clarify, because I think it came up and we can knock this question out real quick. When we talk about a box, it's 4 pens, it's 1 month of medication for a patient at 1 dosage. And it's anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 out of pocket, roughly.
Thank you very much.
Great. Coming back to Gabrielle, your question, do you think the FDA was correct to make such a decision without at least posting a notice on the Federal Register? Scott, I'm going to want you to talk about this. Given the frustrations with the FDA's usual correspondence on this issue, should the agency have a better system in place for preparing pharmacies and patients for the immediate takeaway of permission for compounding? Is it okay? It's a long question. Is it okay that the FDA made this decision based on its own interpretation of what the law says regarding the drug shortages lists and compounding capabilities? And is the law clear enough that the agency is at least in the right moving forward on its own accord? Or was their interpretation of what they can do different enough from other stakeholders to interpret that maybe they shouldn't have?
Boy,
this
there's
is written
a lot there.
down.
Yeah.
I can, let me know if you want me to send this to you as one.
Yeah,
one
I know. I'm reading it. Do I think that FDA was correct? I will tell you that what FDA did in this instance is generally what they've always done with drug shortages. They have taken the data provided them from the drug makers and made a calculation that supply was once again sufficient to meet demand. Now that's the decision they made. I think you've heard here today that at least anecdotally, the facts don't back that up. I believe that because this shortage is not like other shortages, FDA was indeed cavalier in not creating a different framework in which patients could be transitioned to new therapies here. Do I think that they should have put it in the Federal Register? As I understand the lawsuit from the Outsourcing Facilities Association against FDA, one of OFA's claims is that FDA should have adhered to notice and comment rulemaking in taking this drug off the drug shortage list. I confess I don't know how that would work. Typically, FDA makes these decisions based on the data. And, on Monday, a drug comes onto the shortage list and 3 Mondays later, it comes off. But again, this drug shortage is not like other shortages. And so what we've urged the agency to do, they already have the tools, they have the authority to recognize that every drug shortage is not equal. And when they have a drug shortage that affects a vast number of patients the way this one has, and FDA has known all along these patients are taking compounded therapies in this interim period, in this gap period when the drug makers can't manage their supply chains. When that is the case, FDA ought to have a different construct. They ought to have a platform that is portable, that includes an off-ramp for those patients.
So the next drug that we will be dealing with this with, we presume, is going to be semaglutide. And so I have
right. And God help us if FDA doesn't put something in place in time for that drug coming out of shortage, because as Jen and others have said, many more patients are on semaglutide than Tirzepatide. That is the fact with the FDA approved drug, and so we're pretty certain it's also the fact with the compounded versions. FDA needs to take seriously these concerns and build that framework right now for that moment that is coming. We don't know when, but it is coming. Semaglutide is going to come off the shortage list.
Okay. So Again, as regarding unavailability, both Eli Lilly and the FDA have said that when the shortage ended, that there might be intermittent localized supply disruptions as products make their way through the supply chain. Given that it's only been a week, is it too soon to say that unavailability is a major problem?
Yeah, I think until proven otherwise, because it has been a problem, it remains the problem. I think, Joseph, I challenge you, it's 2024 to have a conversation that we have to have on the daily in the outpatient setting of telling people with life-changing medications that they can't have it when they could. And it's as simple as that. It's 2024. Look at the technology we're on. We got 40 people on a call. We got more than enough data to track this better. And as a healthcare professional, as someone who believes that we should have some of the best healthcare in the world, I think we need to do better for our patients.
I want to actually come to, Candace, I'm going to come back to you on this question, but I really want to go to Allison here, because the next logical step is potentially looking at the gray market. And so the question is, are you concerned about more patients turning to the gray market? And what implications do you think this has for patient care and the reputation of licensed compounding pharmacies?
We are extraordinarily concerned about this. We were concerned about it before this Tirzepatide shortage was resolved. There was a study, I think, out of the University of Southern California 2 or 3 months ago that indicated that as many as 40% of online pharmacies were fake. They're not pharmacies at all. They are illicit actors, often offshore. They are sometimes accepting prescriptions, but generally they are selling substances that purport to be GLP-1s to patients without a legitimate prescription. We're very worried about that. It's one area. I mean, I know the drug makers don't like compounding, but one area where our interests converge is patient safety. And I would love to be able to join hands with Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk and other drug makers to help combat this scourge of counterfeiting of all drugs, not just these GLP-1 drugs. There's a letter some of you may have seen, I think it was released yesterday or the day before, from the Republican leaders of the House Energy and Commerce Committee to FDA, basically saying, show us what you've been doing in combating counterfeiting in the GLP-1 space. We're concerned. They've seen that wonderful piece that Catherine wrote in Vanity Fair, and Congress is worried about this scourge of counterfeiting. You would find APC eagerly willing to join with drug makers in figuring out how to combat that. It's one reason that we've provided tools on our website to help patients look up their pharmacy and determine, is it a legitimate state licensed pharmacy? It's a serious concern.
And the problem is, if I can interject here, is that nobody regulates these other people in this gray market, and you can't get anybody to regulate them at the moment. So I've taken screenshots of that and sent that to the executive director of the North Carolina Board of Pharmacy, and he says, we don't regulate those guys. And I'm like, who does? So let's think about this. I can make it in my garage and nobody regulates me, but I put a license on my wall and I'm regulated to death. Wait a minute, that's not fair. How do we get rid of those people? Because like you mentioned there, is it does affect the reputation of compounding pharmacies, because it will get all meddled together if something happens and somebody gets a bad batch of whatever they're getting from the research peptide folks, it'll come back on compounding pharmacy.
Can you
That's actually a lot of,
can you tell we feel strongly about this one?
Well, this is also, I mean, this is honestly why we have reached out to so many of you and have had these conversations with you, because there is this conflation between online, illegal online drug sellers and compounding pharmacies. We saw the FDA commissioner lump them together at one point. We were like, what? No. So we want to be very clear about that. And actually, I wanted, Scott, I think you said it was 40%, and Kelly and Robert check me here, but I'm pretty sure the data is actually, it's 97% of all online drug sellers are illegal, 97%. And that's data that I believe comes out from the National Boards of Pharmacy, so NABP. And so it's a very important issue that is not compounding,
Yeah,
something
and
Scott always
just
says
so that
that
we
a lot of time in pharmacy.
just so that we don't muddy those two numbers, drug sellers is different from pharmacies. I think the pharmacy number is 40%, but it wouldn't surprise me that people just online trying to sell stuff like that is much, much higher.
Yeah. Of course, they give themselves a name that says pharmacy, but doesn't mean
Yeah.
they're actually pharmacy. So they're illegal online drug sellers. Thank you all for indulging us. This is clearly something we all feel very passionate about. I do want to come back to some of this inordinate amounts of compounding conversation. So this was a follow-up from Candace when we were talking a little bit about the what goes into these medications. So to follow up, would the I'm sorry, Candace, would step outside inordinate amounts if telehealth are prescribing thousands of these special combinations?
Inordinate amounts only applies to copies. FDA is essentially a copy guidance, allows copies of FDA-approved drugs when the FDA-approved drug is currently in shortage on the shortage list. But when the drug is not in shortage, weirdly, the guidance allows compounders to make no more than 4 copies of FDA-approved drugs in a month. And it spells out some circumstances in which they can do that. They can't just because they want to make 4 doses of the drug. It may be that there's some sort of emergency situation that would call for them to do that. But inordinate is anything more than 4 in a month, and it only applies in the instance of compounded copies.
So we're also going to follow up a little bit more about these extra ingredients. Adding extra ingredients doesn't feel very individual patient specific in many of the cases I've heard about. It seems like they're prescribing GLP-1s plus XYZ extra ingredient en masse in a way to keep compounding now that there is no shortage, to keep compounding now that there is no shortage. Perhaps this is being done among the less scrupulous compounding pharmacies.
Well, again, you're blaming this on the pharmacy when the pharmacy, nothing happens in a compounding pharmacy until they receive a prescription from a licensed provider. And so the pharmacies are often consulted in these matters, but it's a prescriber who's making the determination that a combination drug of the kind that you mentioned is appropriate for the patient. I do think, I think ultimately there will end up being legal action. I speculate that as these GLP-1s come out of shortage, the drug makers will be much more aggressive in filing lawsuits that assert their intellectual property rights, their patents on these telehealth platforms and others that are making combination products. I do not think it's going to be FDA. FDA has told us in the guidance that they don't tend to question the medical judgment of a provider. I don't think it's going to be state boards of pharmacy. I think it will be lawsuits brought by the drug makers themselves. I suspect one reason they haven't done that already is because just in the court of public opinion, it's kind of a weird place for them to be to say, we've got this life-changing blockbuster drug, it's ours, we can't produce it, and so you can't have any right now. But when the drug comes out of shortage, they're no longer in that situation, and I think we'll see aggressive litigation. Ashley,
Yeah.
we are at 90 minutes. You might want to. I bet these folks want to go to lunch.
I hope someone has eaten lunch before now.
You can have lunch like the pharmacist. You're good.
Yeah.
I mean,
Eating on the fly.
All right. So I will actually, I will give that a wrap. Thank you very much. And then if Arthur, I saw your note, I'll get back to you directly. Thank you everyone for being here.
Ashley, let me real quick. You know, I always do this. Robert's going to roll his eyes because he knows I always do this. Some of you have been in a compounding pharmacy. I believe you would benefit. It would inform your reporting for you to tour a 503A sterile compounding pharmacy. And we have them across the country. We will do our best to orchestrate that for you in a way that's not too far distant. But if you're interested in doing that, let us know, particularly if in the DC area. Scott Welch is the pharmacy at Prestons there. So let us know. We'd be happy to work with you on that.
I also did my tour with Scott Welch, actually, with someone who was on this call. So
yeah,
agreed. It's very, very interesting.
Art's been by too. So happy to host anyone who wants to come to the DC area.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, And we'll be back in touch with materials that we've discussed on this call. Thank you all very much. Please feel free to reach out to myself, Robert, Kelly, any of us. We are happy to help you as you are working on your stories.
Have a good day.
Great. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Good job.
Absolute failure. Absolute failure. I just got out of a closed door meeting with the APC, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounders or Compounding. And it had the CEO, Scott Brunner. It had 3 pharmacists from around the country representing both 503A and 503B. And it was myself and a group of like real reporters like Bloomberg Magazine, Wired, like the caliber was top notch. I'm pretty sure that I was the only user and social media creator in that room. And I'm glad that I was there and I got to ask additional questions because this drug matters to me. Having access matters to me and my friends. Having some kind of warning and having a plan matters to me and my friends. And all of the subscribers and people that follow this and all my other platforms. This matters to us. So I am inherently, this is not just a story. This is my life. So I'm going to break this into series because there's a bunch of different subject matters that are equally infuriating. And then some of them are clarifying. But let's play a little game today called Put a Finger Down. You ready? Put a finger down if the FDA doesn't have a clear rules and guidelines of how a drug goes on and off of shortage. With the hundreds and thousands of Americans that have been on and off of Tirzepatide throughout the 2 years that it's been on the market, and what a blockbuster drug it is that we keep hearing spread all over the headlines, that the FDA had no plan for transition of care.
3 or so months ago, I informally reached out to FDA to raise this issue. We had concerns about transition of care.
Put a finger down if the FDA allows the 503B pharmacies to sell to the 503A pharmacies their API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is Tirzepatide, allows them to sell to the 503A pharmacies, but the second the shortage ends, even though it was bought under a 503B, the rules are unclear whether the 503A can distribute the product that they bought on the 503B.
Because the B prepared the drug, but she's dispensing them. And that is abundantly unclear.
Put a finger down. If the FDA relies solely on the information provided by Eli Lilly to determine whether the shortage is over, they don't go by distributors, suppliers, wholesalers, doctors, patients, pharmacies, solely on the information by big pharma, multi-billion-dollar, speculated to be worth over $1 trillion, the most blockbuster, most profitable drug probably in our lifetimes. Put a finger down if the only person that tells them that it's out of shortage is Eli Lilly.
Did we touch base too on the fact that we really feel that, you know, FDA to remove the drug from the shortage list only takes into account what the manufacturer is telling them?
I'm going to play for you the actual meeting of the people, the pharmacists and Scott Brunner, so you can hear it from yourselves. It's a great meeting. The APC is great. If you remember Scott was, do you guys remember like in June when Eli Lilly sent out that press release, you know, trying to do scare tactics public where do you remember it? Like, they were like, oh, you know, you can't trust these off-label generic wannabe Mounjaros. We are the only legal manufacturer of Mounjaro, and we don't know what they're adding to it. Like, I don't know, just some pink stuff. Like, they didn't know that people were putting vitamin B12 in there, and they played stupid, and they sent all the cease and desist letters out. Do you guys remember that? Well, Scott Brunner was that guy that we all celebrated for a minute because he wrote the letter responding to Eli Lilly and basically saying, like, compounding is safe and legal under the statutes of the 503A, 503B, and we're legally allowed to do so while it's on shortage. And we all cheered him on for a little bit. Well, it's that guy, which is really freaking amazing that I got to, I don't know, be in a virtual room with that guy. So anyways, it was really, really cool being there. Listen to this.